A funeral interrupted by ambition. A duel halted by the dead. Two rivals tearing apart the greatest empire the Sith had ever known. Long before the rule of two, before Darth Bane, before even the ancient wars that shaped the galaxy, there existed a Sith empire of unimaginable power. For over a century, it thrived in golden prosperity under the iron rule of Dark Lord Marka Ragnas. But when death finally claimed even him, two Sith lords stood ready to seize his throne. One believed in the old ways, in tradition and caution. The other dreamed of conquest and expansion across the stars. Their names were Ludo Kressh and Naga Sadow, and their rivalry would doom everything the Sith had built. Picture this: a sacred tomb in the Valley of the Dark Lords. Thousands of Sith watching as lightsabers clash over their fallen master's body. Then, impossibly, a ghost rises from the grave itself to deliver a warning. But the warning goes unheeded. Within days, Republic explorers stumble into Sith space by accident, and the two rivals see the same event in completely opposite ways. One sees invasion, the other sees opportunity. What follows is a tale of manipulation, betrayal, and civil war. A story of fake deaths and real vengeance, of empires crumbling from within, while enemies gather without. And at the center of it all stands Ludo Kressh, the last defender of tradition in an order built on ambition and betrayal. Tonight we journey 5,000 years into the past to witness the fall of the Golden Age, to explore the tragic story of Ludo Kressh, a Sith Lord who fought to save his empire by destroying the very rival who threatened it. A tale of ancient power, philosophical warfare, and the price of being right too late. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Interestingly, about 62% of you watching right now haven't subscribed yet, and honestly, hitting that button really helps this channel grow and lets me bring you more stories like this. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing our global community come together over these ancient tales. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, settle deep into your blanket, and let's travel back to an age when the Sith ruled from the shadows, and one lord's desperate gamble would reshape galactic history forever. Our story begins in the year 5000 before the Battle of Yavin, in a region of space so remote and forbidden that even the Republic had no knowledge of its existence. The Stygian caldera, a dense nebula in the Outer Rim territories, concealed an empire that had existed in isolation for thousands of years. This was Sith space, home to a civilization of dark side wielders who had perfected their mastery of the Force far from the prying eyes of the Jedi Order. At the heart of this empire lay Korriban, the sacred burial world of the Sith. Imagine endless deserts of crimson sand stretching beneath twin blood-red suns, massive stone monuments carved into cliff faces, each one marking the tomb of an ancient Dark Lord. The Valley of the Dark Lords, a canyon where the very air thrums with concentrated dark side energy, where whispers of long-dead Sith Lords seem to echo from the walls themselves. The sky perpetually tinged with rust and amber, as if the planet itself bleeds into the heavens. This was the world that shaped Ludo Kressh. Born into Sith aristocracy, Kressh inherited a legacy that stretched back through countless generations. His bloodline was mixed, descended from both the original Sith species, red-skinned humanoids native to this region of space, and the Dark Jedi who had conquered them millennia ago. This made him Sith in both blood and philosophy, a true inheritor of ancient traditions. From his earliest years, Kressh was steeped in the orthodox teachings of the Sith. He learned that power came not just from raw strength, but from discipline, from mastering the techniques perfected over thousands of years. While other young Sith experimented with forbidden rituals or sought shortcuts to power, Kressh studied the proven methods. He trained in traditional lightsaber combat forms, He mastered Sith sorcery through careful practice rather than reckless innovation. He learned that the Empire had survived for so long precisely because it valued stability over chaos. As he rose through the ranks of Sith society, Kressh became known for his conservative philosophy. Where others saw stagnation, he saw wisdom. The Sith Empire controlled dozens of worlds, commanded vast armies, and possessed knowledge of the Force that the Jedi could scarcely imagine. Why risk everything on expansion when what they had was already magnificent? He established his primary fortress on Relg, a world where he could maintain his contemplation chambers and private sanctuaries. There, surrounded by Sith artifacts and ancient texts, he would meditate on the nature of power and tradition. He kept slaves, as was customary among Sith nobility, and even had a son, Kressh the Younger, whom he hoped would carry on the family's dedication to the old ways. By the time he reached the Sith Council, Ludo Kressh had earned a reputation as a guardian of Sith culture. He was the voice of caution in a society built on passion, the defender of tradition in an order that celebrated ambition, and he would serve loyally on that council for decades, watching as the greatest Dark Lord in Sith history shaped an empire that seemed destined to endure forever. But even golden ages must end, and the seeds of destruction were already taking root. To understand Ludo Kressh, you must first understand the world he served, and that world belonged entirely to one being, Dark Lord Marka Ragnos. For over a century, Marka Ragnos ruled the Sith Empire with absolute authority. Not 10 years, not 20. Over 120 years of uninterrupted dominance. Think about that for a moment. Entire generations of Sith were born, lived their whole lives, and died knowing only one Dark Lord. Stability, in a culture built on betrayal and ambition, became the norm. Under Ragnos, the Empire didn't just survive, it thrived. Sith fleets patrolled their borders unchallenged. Sith academies on Korriban and Ziost trained new generations in the ancient arts. The economy flourished as conquered worlds sent tribute to the capital. Vast temples rose on a dozen planets, monuments to the dark side's supremacy in this corner of the galaxy. Peace by Sith standards meant that the killing was organized, ritualized, controlled. The strong still dominated the weak, but within a framework that prevented the Empire from tearing itself apart. Ludo Kressh came of age during this golden era, and it shaped everything he would become. He watched how Ragnos maintained power, not through constant warfare, but through calculated displays of overwhelming force. The Dark Lord didn't need to conquer new territories every year. He simply made it clear that rebellion was futile and obedience was rewarded. The Empire expanded slowly, methodically, only when victory was certain. Kressh absorbed these lessons completely. As he rose to join the Sith Council, the governing body of lords who advised the Dark Lord, he became known as Ragnos's most orthodox supporter. In council chambers on Ziost, where 10 of the most powerful Sith in the Empire debated policy, Kressh invariably argued for the traditional approach. Why gamble on risky ventures when the proven methods worked perfectly? The council itself met in a citadel that radiated dark side energy like heat from a furnace. Massive chambers carved from black stone, lit by crystals that pulsed with malevolent red light. Here Sith Lords in ornate robes would gather to discuss military campaigns, the training of acolytes, the management of slave populations, and the acquisition of Force artifacts. Kressh attended these meetings for decades, his voice growing more influential with each passing year. But he wasn't the only ambitious Sith Lord on that council. Naga Sado had also risen to prominence during Ragnos's reign, though his path had been very different. Where Kressh valued tradition, Sado valued innovation. Where Kressh saw wisdom in caution, Sado saw cowardice in hesitation. The younger Sith Lord, brilliant and charismatic, had studied the ancient hyperspace routes that connected Sith space to the rest of the galaxy. He knew that beyond their isolated corner of the Outer Rim lay the Republic, a massive government controlling thousands of systems and trillions of beings. In council meetings, Sado would paint vivid pictures of Sith fleets descending on Republic worlds. He spoke of enslaving entire planetary populations, of claiming the galaxy's richest systems, of making the Sith the dominant power in known space. His rhetoric was intoxicating to many of the younger lords, those who had grown restless during the long peace. Kressh would counter every time. He would remind the council that the Republic vastly outnumbered them, that revealing the Sith's existence prematurely would invite retaliation the Empire couldn't withstand, that their strength lay in remaining hidden until the perfect moment, which might not come for centuries. Better a prosperous isolation than a glorious extinction. The debates grew heated over the years. Sado would accuse Kressh of lacking vision, of being content to rot in obscurity while the galaxy passed them by. Kressh would accuse Sado of reckless ambition that endangered everything their ancestors had built. Other council members would take sides, though most remained neutral as long as Ragnos lived. The Dark Lord's authority was simply too absolute to challenge openly. But both Kressh and Sado were positioning themselves. Everyone could see it. Ragnos was ancient, sustained by the dark side, but still mortal. Eventually there would be a succession, and when that day came, the Empire would have to choose between two very different visions of its future. Kressh believed the choice was obvious. Ragnos's reign proved that the traditional path worked. The Empire was wealthy, powerful, secure. Why abandon a successful formula for untested dreams of expansion? He gathered supporters among the conservative lords, those who controlled established territories and had much to lose from radical change. His faction represented the old families, the pure bloodlines, the keepers of Sith orthodoxy. Sado, meanwhile, cultivated a different base. Younger Sith lords, hungry for glory. Military commanders eager for new campaigns. Those who felt the Empire was stagnating. That peace had made them soft. His supporters saw him as a visionary who would restore the Sith to their rightful place as galactic conquerors, rather than hiding in the shadows like criminals. The tension simmered beneath the surface of council meetings for years. Formal debates over minor policies became proxy wars over fundamental philosophy. Every appointment to a military command or governorship became a test of factional strength. The Empire remained unified only because Marka Ragnos towered over everyone, his power and longevity, making him seem almost immortal. In the meditation chambers of his fortress on Relg, Kressh would sometimes wonder if Ragnos understood what was coming. The Dark Lord had to see how divided the council had become. Perhaps he believed his chosen successor would emerge naturally when the time came. Perhaps he thought the council would unite behind the strongest candidate, or perhaps he simply didn't care, confident that the empire he'd built was strong enough to survive whatever succession crisis followed his death. If so, he was tragically mistaken. The empire Marka Ragnos had forged over more than a century was about to fracture along the fault lines between tradition and ambition, caution and conquest, Kressh and Sado, and the first crack would appear at his own funeral. When Marka Ragnos finally died, the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath. The Dark Lord had ruled for so long that many Sith had genuinely believed he might be eternal. But time claims everything eventually, even beings sustained by the dark side of the Force. In his private chambers on Korriban, surrounded by artifacts of 1,000 conquered worlds, Marka Ragnos breathed his last. The single most powerful individual in Sith history, the architect of the Empire's golden age, was gone. The news spread through Sith space like wildfire. On every world from Zeos to Karadelba, from Relg to the outer mining colonies, Sith lords and common citizens alike reacted with shock. For most of them, Ragnos had been the only Dark Lord they'd ever known. His death didn't just create a power vacuum, it shattered the fundamental assumption that had underpinned over a century of stability. According to ancient Sith custom, the funeral would be held on Korriban in the Valley of the Dark Lords. Every Sith of significance was expected to attend. This wasn't optional. To miss the funeral of a Dark Lord was an insult that could cost you your life. And so they came from every corner of the Empire, converging on the burial world in a massive procession that took days to assemble. Ludo Kressh had been granted an extraordinary honor. He would lead the funeral procession itself. This role, traditionally given to the Dark Lord's closest advisor, or most likely successor, involved carrying Ragnos's war helm through the valley to the prepared tomb. The helm, an ancient artifact imbued with dark side energy, would be placed with Ragnos's body so the Dark Lord could continue his battles in whatever afterlife awaited Sith spirits. On the day of the funeral, Kressh stood at the head of a column that stretched for miles. Behind him came the other council members in strict order of precedence. Behind them, hundreds of Sith lords in ceremonial robes. Behind them, thousands of warriors, acolytes, and slaves. The procession wound through the Valley of the Dark Lords like a dark river flowing between monuments to ancient power. The tombs on either side rose like cliffs, carved directly into the canyon walls. Each one housed the remains of a Dark Lord from ages past. Sealed chambers guarded by traps, curses, and sometimes worse things. Walking between them felt like passing through a gauntlet of ghosts. The air practically vibrated with accumulated dark side energy, the psychic residue of thousands of years of Sith history. Kressh carried the helm reverently, feeling its weight, both physical and symbolic. In some ways, this moment represented everything he'd worked for. He was being publicly acknowledged as the keeper of Sith tradition, the guardian of their heritage. Surely the council would see the appropriateness of naming him as Ragnos' successor, who better to continue the old ways than the Lord who embodied them. Torches burned along the procession route, their light barely pushing back the gloom of Korriban's perpetual twilight. Sith priests chanted in ancient dialects, languages so old that few still living could translate them. The sound echoed off stone, creating an eerie harmony that seemed to come from the tombs themselves. Above, Korriban's twin suns hung low and red, casting everything in shades of blood and rust. They reached Ragnos's prepared tomb, a massive structure carved into the valley wall. The entrance gaped like an open mouth, steps leading down into darkness. Kressh ascended a platform before the entrance, ready to deliver the traditional oration before the ceiling. Behind him, the tomb entrance showed glimpses of the sarcophagus within, already prepared to receive the Dark Lord's body. He had just opened his mouth to begin the formal words when movement in the crowd caught his eye. Naga Sado was arriving, late, deliberately, insultingly late. The younger Sith Lord strode through the assembled masses, who parted before him with nervous glances. The Sado wore robes of deep crimson, adorned with symbols that proclaimed his ambitions openly. His expression was one of supreme confidence, bordering on arrogance. He walked as if he owned the valley, as if everyone gathered there existed only to witness his moment. Kressh felt rage ignite in his chest. To arrive late to a Dark Lord's funeral was more than disrespectful. It was sacrilege. It spat on everything Ragnos had represented, everything the Sith held sacred. The message was clear and intentional. Sado was announcing that he considered himself above tradition, that the old rules no longer applied to him. The younger Sith Lord stopped before the tomb entrance, directly confronting Kressh. For a long moment the two rivals stared at each other while thousands of Sith watched in tense silence. Then Sado spoke, his voice carrying across the valley through some application of the Force. He declared that the title of Dark Lord of the Sith belonged to him by right, that the Empire needed a leader with vision, not a caretaker who would maintain the status quo until decay set in, that the age of hiding in the Outer Rim was over. that under his rule, the Sith would claim their destiny as masters of the galaxy. Kressh's fury reached a breaking point. Here, at the very tomb of their greatest leader, Sado dared to turn the funeral into a political speech. He dared to claim authority before Ragnos was even properly entombed. The sheer disrespect of it was beyond bearing. He told Sado that his insolence had forever stained the memory of Marka Ragnos, that his vision was nothing but reckless ambition that would destroy everything they'd built, that he represented everything wrong with the younger generation of Sith who mistook boldness for wisdom, that if Sado believed himself worthy of leadership, he would have to prove it. The accusations flew back and forth, each one more heated than the last. Sado called Kressh a coward hiding behind tradition. Kressh called Sado a fool who would lead them all to ruin. Other council members tried to intervene, to remind them both that this was neither the time nor the place, but their voices were lost in the rising tide of anger. The argument reached a point where words became insufficient. Both Sith Lords were beyond reason now, beyond politics, beyond even basic respect for where they stood. They'd been circling each other for years, and the death of the one authority figure capable of restraining them had removed the last barrier. Ludo Kressh set down Marka Ragnos's helm. He drew his weapon, and before the assembled might of the Sith Empire, at the entrance to their greatest leader's tomb, he attacked Naga Sado with killing intent. The duel for the future of the Sith had begun. The clash of their weapons echoed off the valley walls like thunder. Kressh struck first, his rage giving power to the blow. His Sith sword, a traditional blade infused with dark side energy, came down in a devastating arc, meant to split Sado from shoulder to hip. But Sado was ready, his own blade rising to meet the strike in a shower of crimson sparks. The two weapons, each a masterwork of Sith alchemy, screamed as they ground against each other. Around them, the thousands of assembled Sith reacted with shock and excitement. Some shouted encouragement to their chosen champion. Others simply watched in horrified fascination as two council members tried to kill each other at the holiest site in the Empire. A few of the older, wiser lords attempted to push through the crowd to stop this madness, but they were too far away, and events were unfolding too quickly. Kressh pressed his advantage, driving Sado back toward the tomb entrance with a series of powerful strikes. His fighting style was traditional Sith combat, perfected over decades of practice. Every movement had been drilled into him since childhood. There was no wasted motion, no uncertainty, just brutal, efficient violence, honed by a lifetime of training. Sado gave ground, but not from weakness. He was studying Kressh's pattern, looking for an opening. His own style was less orthodox, incorporating techniques he'd developed through personal experimentation. Where Kressh's attacks came in predictable rhythms, Sado's defense was improvisational, adapting moment by moment. The older Sith Lord began channeling the Force, feeling it respond to his anger. Dark side energy crackled around his free hand, building toward a devastating release. He swung his sword in a feint, and when Sado moved to block, Kressh thrust his palm forward. Lightning erupted from his fingertips, a jagged bolt of purple energy that slammed into Sado's chest and sent him sprawling backward. The crowd roared. Sado hit the ground hard, his robes smoking from the impact. For a moment, it seemed the duel might end right there. Kressh advanced, raising his blade for a killing stroke. Victory was within reach. He could end this pretender's challenge, cement his claim to leadership, and restore order to the succession. But Sado rolled aside just as the blade came down, the sword striking stone where his head had been an instant before. The younger Sith Lord extended his own hand, and the Force responded differently. Not lightning, but a wave of pure kinetic energy that caught Kressh in the midsection and lifted him off his feet. He flew backward several meters before crashing into the crowd, which scattered to avoid being crushed. Now it was Sadow's turn to press the attack. He leaped forward with force-enhanced speed, closing the distance before Kressh could fully recover. His blade came in from an unexpected angle, and Kressh barely got his weapon up in time to parry. The impact jarred his arms, nearly knocking the sword from his grip. They traded blows in a flurry too fast for most observers to follow. The sound of clashing blades became a continuous ringing that drowned out even the shouts of the crowd. Both Sith Lords were drawing heavily on the Force now, their movements enhanced beyond normal capability. They seemed to blur to exist in multiple places at once as they attacked and countered with inhuman speed. Kressh scored a hit, his blade slicing across Sadow's shoulder and drawing first blood. Sadow retaliated by using the Force to tear loose chunks of stone from the valley floor and hurl them at his opponent. Kressh shattered them with pulses of dark side energy, but the assault forced him back, giving Sadow room to recover. The duel became more vicious. These weren't practice strikes anymore. Both fighters were genuinely trying to kill each other, and both possessed the skill to succeed. Kresh's experience was being matched by Sadow's raw power. The younger Sith Lord was stronger in the Force than Kressh had realized, and that strength was beginning to tell. Sadow caught Kressh with a telekinetic grip, invisible hands closing around the older Sith's throat. Kressh felt himself being lifted into the air, his breath cut off as Sadow squeezed. He struggled, trying to break free through his own Force abilities, but Sadow's hold was strong. The world started to darken at the edges of his vision. In desperation, Kressh lashed out with everything he had. A burst of uncontrolled dark side energy exploded from him in all directions, a shockwave of pure malevolence that broke Sadow's concentration and sent both fighters tumbling away from each other. Several spectators in the crowd were knocked down by the overflow of power. Both Sith Lords climbed to their feet, breathing hard now, bloodied and exhausted, but neither willing to yield. They raised their weapons again, preparing for another exchange that might finally end this. The watching Sith pressed closer, sensing that a decisive moment was approaching, and then the temperature dropped. It was subtle at first, a slight chill in the air, but it grew rapidly colder, far colder than Korriban's climate should allow. Frost began forming on the ground around the tomb entrance. The torches lining the procession route flickered and dimmed. An unnatural wind rose from nowhere, carrying with it a sense of presence that made even the most powerful Sith Lords in the crowd take an involuntary step backward. Something was coming, something neither Kressh nor Sadow had anticipated. The darkness within the tomb entrance seemed to deepen, to become almost solid, and from that darkness a figure began to emerge. At first it was barely visible, just a suggestion of shape in the shadows, but it grew more distinct with each passing second, until there was no mistaking what they were seeing. The ghost of Marka Ragnos stood before his own tomb. The spirit was massive, far larger than any living being could be, towered over the assembled Sith, translucent but unmistakably real. Energy crackled around its form, the residue of dark side power, so immense that it had transcended death itself. The spectre wore the same robes Ragnos had worn in life, and in its ghostly hands it held the war helm that Kressh had set aside to begin the duel. Every Sith in the valley, from the mightiest lord to the lowest slave, fell to their knees. Even Kressh and Sadow, still clutching their weapons, dropped to one knee in instinctive reverence. You didn't face a Dark Lord this powerful, even dead, without showing proper respect. The ghost spoke, and its voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. It told them that the fate of the entire Sith Empire hung in the balance, that their internal conflicts threatened everything he had built, that they needed to choose their battles with wisdom rather than allowing passion to blind them. The future of their people depended on unity, not division. The spirit offered no clear guidance on the succession. It didn't name a chosen heir or settle the dispute. Instead, It warned them both that greater threats were coming, threats they couldn't even imagine. And with that cryptic message delivered, the ghost of Marka Ragnus faded back into the darkness of the tomb, leaving behind only an unnatural cold and thousands of stunned Sith. Kressh and Sado stood slowly, eyeing each other warily. The immediate urge to kill had been dampened by their master's intervention from beyond death. Kressh found himself wondering if perhaps reconciliation was possible after all. If Ragnus thought they should work together, maybe there was a way to compromise, to combine their strengths rather than letting their differences tear the Empire apart. He was about to extend an offer to talk when the sky above them began to glow. Everyone looked up. Something was entering the atmosphere. A ship, but not a Sith design. It was moving erratically, clearly in distress, engines sputtering as it descended toward the valley. The vessel struggled to control its descent, banking hard to avoid crashing into the assembled crowd. It managed a rough landing about 100 meters from the tomb entrance, skidding across Kuraban's rocky surface before finally coming to rest. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a hatch opened and two figures emerged. They were human, dressed in clothes that no Sith had ever seen before. They looked around at the thousands of armed Sith staring at them, at the monuments to ancient power surrounding them, at the barely sealed tomb behind them. One of them, a young woman, raised her hands in what was clearly meant as a peaceful gesture. She called out that they came from the Galactic Republic, that they were hyperspace explorers who had gotten lost and stumbled into this system by accident, that they meant no harm and simply wanted to repair their ship and leave. Massassi guards were already moving toward them, weapons drawn. The two humans were seized before they could make any further statements, and as they were dragged toward the Sith Lords for judgment, Ludo Kressh felt ice form in his stomach that had nothing to do with Ragnus's ghost. The Republic here, now everything he'd feared, everything he'd warned the Council about for years, was suddenly terrifyingly real. He looked at Sado and saw an entirely different reaction on his rival's face. Not fear, not concern, but excitement. The gleam of opportunity recognized. Their duel had been interrupted, but Kressh realized with growing horror that this was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning. The two humans were named Gav and Jory Darrigan, brother and sister, and they had just made the worst navigational error in galactic history. They'd been trying to chart new hyperspace routes in the Outer Rim, hoping to make their fortune as explorers. Their ship, the Starbreaker 12, had suffered a malfunction that threw them wildly off course. When they dropped out of hyperspace, they found themselves in a region of space that existed on no Republic charts. Desperate and low on fuel, they'd followed sensor readings to the nearest inhabited planet. That planet happened to be Kuraban, and they'd arrived in the middle of a Dark Lord's funeral. Within minutes of their capture, the siblings were bound and transported to Ziost, the administrative capital of the Sith Empire. The entire Sith Council was summoned for an emergency session. What had begun as a funeral procession transformed into a crisis that demanded immediate attention. The question before the Council was simple but profound. What do you do when the outside galaxy discovers your existence? The Council chamber on Ziost was a structure designed to intimidate. Black stone walls rose to a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. 10 thrones arranged in a semicircle, each one occupied by a Sith Lord of immense power. At the center of the chamber, Gav and Jory Darrigan stood in chains, surrounded by Massassi guards whose sole purpose was dealing death to the Council's enemies. The siblings were terrified, though they tried not to show it. They'd heard rumors of the Sith, ancient legends whispered in Republic bars about dark sorcerers who'd been driven into exile thousands of years ago. But those were just stories. Nobody actually believed the Sith still existed. And yet here they were, standing before what was clearly a government of Force users who radiated malevolence like heat from a star. Ludo Kressh spoke first, his voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. Execute them immediately. Both of them. No interrogation, no hesitation, no mercy. They were Republic spies, he insisted, sent to gather intelligence on the Sith before a full-scale invasion. The fact that they claimed to have arrived by accident was obviously a lie. The Republic had discovered Sith space, which meant everything the Empire had built was now at risk. He painted a dire picture for the Council. The Republic controlled thousands of systems and trillions of citizens. They had the Jedi Order, warriors who wielded the light side of the Force with skill that might rival the Sith. If the Republic learned of the Empire's location and decided they represented a threat, they could bring overwhelming force to bear. The Sith's only advantage had been secrecy, and these two humans had just stripped that advantage away. The solution was clear: kill the intruders, destroy their ship, and every trace of their visit. Seal the borders, and pray that the Republic assumed they'd simply disappeared into the unknown regions, lost to some navigational hazard. It was brutal, but it was the only way to maintain the isolation that had protected the Empire for millennia. Naga Sado rose from his throne, and his response was exactly what Kressh had feared. He argued the opposite position, with equal passion. Don't kill them, he insisted. Interrogate them. Learn everything they know about the Republic. Use them to gather intelligence on Republic defenses, military strength, political divisions. These humans weren't a threat. They were a gift. Sado's vision expanded as he spoke, his words weaving a picture that captured the imagination of several council members. The Republic had grown complacent, he argued. They'd known peace for so long that they'd forgotten how to fight a real war. Their Jedi were peacekeepers, not warriors. Their military was designed for defense, not conquest. If the Sith struck hard and fast before the Republic even knew they existed, they could seize control of key systems before meaningful resistance could be organized. These two explorers had handed them a roadmap to victory. They knew the hyperspace routes. They could identify which systems were heavily defended and which were vulnerable. They represented everything the Sith needed to launch a successful invasion. Killing them would be the ultimate waste of an opportunity that might never come again. The debate grew heated quickly. Other council members began taking sides, their voices rising as they argued over the fate of the prisoners and, by extension, the future of the Empire. Simis, one of the eldest lords, supported Sado's position, but urged caution in execution. Several younger members were enthusiastic about the prospect of conquest. A few remained neutral, clearly calculating which faction would emerge victorious before committing their support. Kressh felt his frustration mounting with every word Sado spoke. Could the other lords not see the insanity of this proposal? They were talking about invading a government that dwarfed them in every measurable way. The Republic's military might not be as vicious as the Sith, but it was vast. Provoking them was suicide dressed up as ambition. He tried a different approach. Even if they could achieve early victories, he argued, what then? The Republic would unite against them. Every system, every species, every Force user loyal to the Jedi would pour resources into destroying the Sith. The Empire might win battles, but they'd lose the war through sheer attrition. Their only sustainable path was patience, remain hidden, grow stronger in isolation, strike only when victory was absolutely certain, even if that took centuries. Sado dismissed this as cowardice. He accused Kressh of being so afraid of risk that he'd let the greatest opportunity in Sith history slip away. The Empire had been hiding for thousands of years. How much longer did Kressh want to wait? Another 1,000 years? 10,000? At what point did caution become stagnation? The personal animosity between them infected the entire debate. What should have been a rational discussion of strategy became another proxy war in their ongoing rivalry. Council members weren't just choosing between policies anymore. They were choosing between leaders, between visions, between fundamentally different ideas of what the Sith Empire should become. Gav and Jory Darrigan watched this unfold with growing confusion. They had no idea what was being said, as the Sith spoke in their own language, but they could read the body language. They could see the council fragmenting before their eyes. Whatever they'd stumbled into, it was tearing this government apart. The session ended without resolution. Kressh's faction blocked any attempt to use the prisoners for intelligence gathering. Sado's faction prevented any motion to execute them. The compromise was to keep them imprisoned while the council continued deliberating. Both siblings were led away to cells deep beneath the citadel, where they'd wait while the Sith decided whether they lived or died. But Kressh left that council chamber knowing something had shifted. Sado had gained ground. Several lords who'd been neutral before were now leaning toward his aggressive stance. The younger Sith Lord's rhetoric about seizing destiny and claiming the galaxy had resonated in a way that Kressh's warnings simply hadn't. Worse, Kressh could feel Sado's ambition growing more reckless. His rival wasn't going to wait for the council to reach consensus. He was going to act, and he was going to do whatever it took to get what he wanted. The only question was what form that action would take. Kressh returned to his fortress on Relg that night with a sense of impending disaster. He meditated in his private chambers, surrounded by ancient Sith artifacts, trying to see a path forward that didn't end in catastrophe. But the visions that came to him in the dark were all fire and blood, fleets burning in space, and the empire he'd served his entire life crumbling into ash. Somewhere on Zeist, Naga Sado was having very different visions of conquest and glory, and he was already putting plans in motion that would force the entire empire onto the path he'd chosen, whether they wanted it or not. 3 days after the council debate, the guards protecting the Starbreaker 12 were found dead. The attack came in the middle of the night. Massey warriors, elite soldiers loyal to various Sith Lords, had been stationed around the impound hangar where the Republic ship was being held. When the next shift arrived for duty rotation, they found corpses. The guards had been killed efficiently, professionally, and the Starbreaker 12 was gone. Initial reports suggested a Republic rescue mission. Somehow, despite being trapped deep in Sith space, the Galactic Republic had mounted an operation to retrieve their lost explorers. It seemed to validate everything Kressh had been warning about. The Republic knew where they were, and they were already taking aggressive action. Kressh rushed to the scene as soon as word reached him. The hangar was still secured. Investigators combing through evidence. He studied the bodies, the blast patterns, the way the guards had been positioned when they died. Something felt wrong about the whole scenario. Too convenient, too perfectly timed to inflame anti-Republic sentiment. Then one of his subordinates found it, a piece of armor, partially hidden beneath one of the dead guards. It bore an insignia that Kressh recognized immediately. Naga Sado's personal symbol. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a Republic attack. Sado had staged the whole thing. He'd sent his own Massassi to kill Sith guards, steal the ship, and make it look like an invasion. The younger Sith Lord was manufacturing a crisis, creating the justification for war that the Council had refused to give him legitimately. Kressh felt rage mixing with something close to despair. Sado hadn't just crossed a line, he'd obliterated it. Killing fellow Sith to advance a political agenda was beyond ambitious. It was treasonous. It spat on every principle the Empire was built on. And if Kressh didn't stop him now, Sado would use this manufactured incident to drag the entire Empire into a war they couldn't win. He sent urgent messages to the 2 Sith Lords he trusted most, Horak Mol and Dor Gail Ram, both senior council members who shared his conservative philosophy. They came to meet him on Relg, taking an enormous risk by doing so. If Sado discovered they were conspiring against him, he could have them executed for treason. But the stakes were too high for caution anymore. In Kress's contemplation chambers, the three lords planned their response. Sado had moved too fast for them to expose his deception through official channels. By the time they convinced the full council, Sado would have consolidated his position as Dark Lord and committed the Empire to war. Their only option was direct action, military action. Horak Mol and Galram agreed to commit their personal fleets. Combined with Kress's forces, they'd have enough firepower to challenge Sado directly. The plan was simple but desperate. Strike Sado's fortress before he could launch his Republic invasion. Remove him from power by force. Present the council with evidence of his treachery after the fact, and argue they'd saved the Empire from a traitor. It was dangerous. It was legally questionable, but Kressh couldn't see any other way to stop what was coming. Sado, meanwhile, had been busy. In the days following the staged attack, he'd moved decisively. He convinced enough council members that the Republic threat required immediate leadership. In an emergency session that Kressh's faction boycotted, Sado was named Dark Lord of the Sith. It wasn't a unanimous decision, but it was official enough to give him authority. His first act as Dark Lord was to separate the Daragon siblings. Jory remained on Kar Delba, a fortress world Sado controlled at the edge of Sith space. Gav was taken to Kar Shan, the moon orbiting Kar Delba, where Sado kept his true headquarters. The younger human showed promise in the Force, and Sado had begun training him personally, molding him into a weapon that could be used against the Republic. Kresh's attack fleet, assembled in secret over several days, dozens of Sith warships, their crews loyal to the traditionalist cause, gathered at a rendezvous point on the far side of Relg. When they were ready, Kressh gave the order to jump to hyperspace. Their destination was Kar Delba. Their objective was to end Naga Sado's ambitions permanently. The fleet emerged from hyperspace in Kar Delba's orbit with weapons already charging. Kressh stood on the bridge of his flagship, staring at the fortress on the planet's surface. It looked formidable, bristling with defensive turrets and surrounded by shield generators. But Kressh brought enough firepower to overwhelm those defenses. This ended today, one way or another. He opened a channel to broadcast to all ships. His message was simple. They were here to stop a traitor who would destroy the Empire. Sado had murdered fellow Sith and manufactured a crisis to seize power. This was about preservation, about protecting everything their ancestors had built. The orbital bombardment began immediately. Lance after lance of energy stabbed down from the fleet, slamming into Kar Delba's surface. Shield generators flared and overloaded. Defensive turrets returned fire, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Within minutes the fortress was taking direct hits. Sections of the structure began to collapse as turbo laser fire punched through walls and detonated internal systems. Kressh personally manned one of his flagship's weapon stations, firing controlled bursts at specific targets. He wanted to hurt Sado, to make him feel the consequences of his betrayal. Every shot that connected brought a grim satisfaction. This was justice, delivered in fire and fury. Horak Mul and Gal Ram commanded their own vessels in the assault, their ships adding to the devastating rain of destruction. They communicated frequently, coordinating their attack patterns, optimizing their fire solutions. The fortress didn't stand a chance. Sado's defenses were crumbling, his position becoming untenable with each passing minute. On the planet's surface, amid the chaos of the bombardment, something unexpected happened. Jory Daragon escaped. Sado himself led her to the Starbreaker 12, which had been hidden in a concealed hangar. He gave her clearance codes to pass through the blockade and told her to flee back to the Republic. She didn't understand why her captor was suddenly helping her, but she wasn't about to argue. The Starbreaker 12 launched under heavy fire, dodging through the battle and making the jump to hyperspace before Kresh's forces could intercept. What Jory didn't know was that Sado had planted a homing beacon on her ship. He was letting her go deliberately, giving her a way to lead him straight to the heart of the Republic. But Kressh, watching the small freighter escape his blockade, could only see it as another failure. Sadow's manipulation was slipping through his fingers again. Then, everything changed. From behind Kar Delba's moon, a massive fleet emerged. Dozens of Sith warships that hadn't been there moments before suddenly appeared, their weapons already locked on Kress's forces. The fortress on Kar Delba had been a decoy. Sadow's real headquarters was on Kar Shian, the moon itself, and he'd hidden his entire military force there. Sadow's voice boomed across all channels, mocking and triumphant. He congratulated Kressh on attacking the wrong target. Every spy Kressh had sent had fed him false information. Every tactical assessment had been deliberately wrong. Sadow had known this attack was coming, had planned for it, had turned it into another trap. The hidden fleet opened fire. Kresh's forces were caught between the surface defenses, which had been playing weak deliberately, and the massive armada emerging from the moon. Ships on both sides began taking catastrophic damage as the space above Kar Delba transformed into a maelstrom of destruction. But Sadow had saved his cruelest stroke for last. Aboard Horak Mol's flagship and Gal Ram's command vessel, Massassi warriors who'd been secretly loyal to Sadow all along launched their mutiny. They turned on their commanders without warning, cutting down bridge officers and seizing control of critical systems. Both Sith Lords died in the coup, murdered by their own crews. The two captured vessels immediately turned their guns on Kressh. His fleet, already reeling from the ambush, now faced betrayal from within. Ships that had been allies seconds ago were firing on him. The tactical situation collapsed from manageable to catastrophic in the span of heartbeats. Kressh realized with terrible clarity that he'd lost. Sadow had outplayed him at every turn. The younger Sith Lord's cunning had proven superior to his experience. His remaining ships were taking heavy casualties, their formations breaking apart under the coordinated assault. If he stayed, his entire force would be annihilated. The order to retreat was the hardest command he'd ever given. His flagship turned away from the battle, its engines burning at maximum as it clawed for distance. The surviving ships of his fleet followed, those that still could, jumping to hyperspace as soon as they reached minimum safe distance. Behind them Kar Delba burned, and Sadow's fleet pursued just long enough to ensure the lesson was learned. Kressh emerged from hyperspace on the far side of Relg, his fleet reduced to a fraction of its original strength. He'd gambled everything on this attack and lost decisively. Two of his most trusted allies were dead, dozens of ships destroyed, hundreds of loyal Sith killed, and Sadow was now unquestionably in control of the Empire. But Kressh wasn't finished. Not yet. He still had one move left, one final card to play. It would require faking his own death, going into hiding and waiting for Sadow's ambitions to inevitably lead to disaster. Kressh would bide his time, rebuild his strength, and when Sadow returned from his doomed invasion in defeat, Kressh would be there to finish what he'd started. He sent his flagship back toward Kar Delba, but this time it was empty. A decoy, just as Sadow had used against him. The ship broadcast messages of defiance, challenging Sadow to face him directly. And when Sadow's forces destroyed it, everyone would believe Ludo Kressh had died in one final futile gesture of resistance. In reality, Kressh transferred to a smaller vessel and disappeared into the depths of Sith space. Let Sadow think he'd won. Let him have his war with the Republic. Time would prove which of them had been right all along. And when that time came, Kressh would be ready to reclaim what was rightfully his. The months following the Battle of Kar Delba brought a strange peace to Ludo Kressh. Not the peace of victory, but the quiet of exile. He'd found refuge on a remote world at the very edge of Sith space, a planet so insignificant it didn't even have an official name in Imperial records. There were ruins here, temples built by some ancient civilization that had worshipped dark side entities long before the Sith arrived in this region. Kressh walked among those ruins daily, meditating on failure and planning for redemption. The planet's star hung low and red in the sky, casting everything in shades of amber and rust. Wind whistled through the broken temples, creating sounds that almost resembled voices. Sometimes, in the deepest chambers, Kressh thought he could feel presences watching him. The ghosts of whatever people had built this place, perhaps, or just the echoes of so much accumulated dark side energy creating phantoms in his mind. He would sit for hours on ancient steps, looking out over landscapes untouched by civilization for millennia. There was a bitter irony in his situation. He'd spent his entire life fighting to preserve the Sith Empire, and now he was reduced to hiding on a forgotten rock while that empire rushed toward destruction under Sadow's leadership. Intelligence still reached him, though. Kressh maintained contacts throughout the empire. Sith who shared his philosophy and fed him information about Sadow's actions. The reports painted exactly the picture he'd feared. Naga Sadow had launched his invasion of the Republic. The Great Hyperspace War, as it would come to be known, had begun. Sadow's strategy relied heavily on deception. His actual fleet was smaller than he let on, but he used Sith sorcery to create illusions that made it appear vast. Phantom ships that looked real to sensors, doubled images of star destroyers, entire armadas that existed only as projections in the Force. It was brilliant in its audacity, and initially it worked. The Republic panicked. Coruscant itself came under attack, Sith forces appearing in the heart of their territory with no warning. The Korra system, one of the wealthiest regions in the Republic, faced a simultaneous assault. Worlds that had known peace for generations suddenly found themselves under bombardment. The Jedi scrambled to respond, but they were peacekeepers, not warriors. They'd forgotten how to fight a real military campaign. Kressh watched these developments with deeply conflicted emotions. Part of him took pride in Sith victories. These were his people, after all, demonstrating their superiority over the complacent Republic. Every world that fell proved the power of the dark side, the strength of the traditions he'd dedicated his life to preserving. But another part of him felt only dread, because he knew how this ended. The Republic might be caught off guard initially, but they had resources the Sith couldn't match. They had thousands of systems to draw on. They had the Jedi, who would adapt once they understood the threat. Most importantly, they had numbers. Even if Sadow won every battle, eventually the Republic would grind the Sith down through sheer attrition. His predictions began coming true faster than even he'd anticipated. The Republic rallied under the leadership of Empress Teta, the ruler of the Koros system. She organized a coordinated counterattack, bringing together forces from multiple sectors. The Jedi Order committed fully to the war effort, their Force abilities countering many of the Sith advantages. Sadow's illusions were discovered and pierced. Once the Republic realized that much of his fleet was fake, they developed tactics to distinguish real ships from phantoms. The psychological advantage the Sith had enjoyed evaporated. Battles that had been easy victories became costly struggles. Sadow's forces began taking serious losses. Then came the reports of Gav Daragon's death. Sadow had been training the young human as his apprentice, using him as a guide through Republic space. But when Gav began to question his master's methods, when he started to see the destruction being wrought in his name, Sadow killed him, betrayed him in the same casual way he'd betrayed everyone else who'd trusted him. The news of this reached Kressh on his nameless world, and he felt something close to pity. Gav Daragon had been a tool in Sadow's hands, nothing more. The moment he stopped being useful, he was discarded. It was the Sith way, perhaps, but it was also proof of everything Kressh had argued. Sadow's ambition consumed everything around him, ally and enemy alike. The Republic counteroffensive gained momentum. Sith positions fell one after another. The invasion that was supposed to bring the galaxy to its knees was collapsing. Sadow's forces were being pushed back towards Sith space, fighting running battles the whole way. The casualties were staggering, entire fleets destroyed, thousands of Sith warriors dead. And for what? To satisfy one lord's hunger for conquest. Kressh received word that Sadow was in full retreat, his remaining ships fleeing toward Korriban. The Republic was pursuing, their forces stronger and more numerous than they'd been at the start of the war. The Dark Lord, who'd promised galactic domination, was running home in defeat, trailing a vengeful enemy behind him. This was the moment Kressh had been waiting for. He stood from his meditation on the temple steps and looked up at the red sun setting over alien ruins. The time for hiding had ended. Naga Sadow was returning to Sith space broken and weakened, and Ludo Kressh would be there to greet him. Justice, delayed but not denied, was finally at hand. The fleet that dropped out of hyperspace above Korriban was a shadow of what had departed months earlier. Naga Sadow's armada, which had once numbered in the hundreds of vessels, now consisted of perhaps 30 ships. Most of those were damaged, their hulls scarred by Republic fire, their shields flickering and unstable. Crew casualties had been severe. Many ships were operating with skeleton crews, barely enough personnel to keep essential systems running. This wasn't a conquering force returning in triumph. It was a broken army limping home to lick its wounds. Sadow stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Corsair, staring at the view screen that showed Korriban hanging in space ahead. The graveyard world looked exactly as he remembered, red and lifeless, covered in monuments to dead Sith Lords. Once he'd seen it as a symbol of everything that held the Empire back, a planet dedicated to honoring the past rather than building the future. Now it represented something else. Sanctuary. A place to regroup before the Republic pursuit caught up with him. His plan was to rally whatever forces remained in Sith space. Other lords who hadn't joined the invasion still commanded fleets. The Empire's core worlds had defenses that hadn't been committed to the war. If he could consolidate those assets, organize a proper defense of Sith territory, he might still salvage something from this disaster. The war wasn't lost. It had just become more difficult than anticipated. The fleet was moving into orbit when sensors detected another group of ships, dozens of them, already in position around Korriban. At first, Sadow's tactical officers assumed they were friendly forces, other Sith vessels come to provide escort. Then the identification signatures came through, and confusion turned to shock. These were ships from Ludo Kressh's fleet, the same vessels that had attacked Cobb Delba, the same forces that Sadow thought he'd destroyed or scattered months ago. But that was impossible. Kressh was dead. His flagship had been shot down. Everyone had seen it. Then the lead vessel opened a communication channel, and Ludo Kressh's face appeared on the view screen. The older Sith Lord looked different. Thinner, harder, with an intensity in his eyes that bordered on fanatical. He began speaking, his voice broadcast not just to Sadow's fleet, but to every ship in the system. He wanted everyone to hear this. He explained how he'd faked his death. The flagship Sadow destroyed had been empty, a decoy sent to make everyone believe Kressh had perished in a final act of defiance. In reality, Kressh had gone into hiding, watching and waiting while Sadow pursued his doomed invasion. Now the truth was clear for all to see. Sadow's ambition had brought the Empire to ruin. His reckless war had cost thousands of Sith lives and achieved nothing except exposing them to Republic retaliation. Kressh declared himself the true Dark Lord of the Sith. Sadow's claim to that title was void, based on manipulation and treachery. The Empire needed leadership that would restore order, that would salvage what could be saved from the catastrophe Sado had created. And that leadership could not, include Naga Sado. Therefore, Ludo Kressh, speaking with the authority of a proper Dark Lord, formally banished Naga Sado from the Sith Empire. Forever, he was to take his remaining ships and leave Sith space immediately. If he refused, Kresh's fleet would destroy him, not as an enemy but as a traitor receiving the execution he'd earned. The pronouncement hung in the space between the two fleets. Sado's officers looked to him, waiting for orders. Some appeared relieved, ready to accept any leadership that might end this nightmare. Others seemed uncertain, caught between two lords and unsure which to follow. A few looked angry, loyal to Sado, despite everything and ready to fight whoever he told them to fight. Sado himself felt something he rarely experienced. Fear, not of death, which every Sith accepted as a possibility, but of losing, of having his grand vision, his dream of Sith dominance, reduced to nothing, of being remembered not as the Lord who conquered the galaxy, but as the fool who destroyed an empire. That fear lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then pride and fury burned it away. Kressh thought he could just dismiss him, send him into exile like some failed apprentice. Sado had seen things Kressh couldn't imagine. He'd walked on Coruscant, the heart of the Republic. He'd fought Jedi in personal combat. He'd commanded fleets in a real war, not just council chamber debates about hypothetical threats. If Kressh wanted him gone, Kressh would have to make him leave, and Sado still had enough ships, enough power to make that very costly. He gave his fleet the order to attack. The space above Korriban erupted into chaos. Turbolaser fire Kressh crossed the void, bright lances of energy seeking enemy hulls. Sado's forces were outnumbered, but they were also veterans now, crews who'd survived months of combat against the Republic. They knew how to fight damaged ships, how to maximize limited resources, how to stay alive when the odds were against them. Kresh's fleet had the advantage of numbers and fresh ships, but many of his crews lacked real combat experience. They'd spent the war in Sith space, while Sado's forces did the actual fighting. That inexperience showed as the battle developed. Ships that should have coordinated their fire instead got in each other's way. Formation discipline broke down as individual captains made impulsive decisions. But slowly, inevitably, superior numbers began to tell. Sado's ships were taking more hits than they could absorb. One of his cruisers lost containment in its main reactor, the explosion tearing the vessel in half. Another had its engines disabled and began drifting, helpless and vulnerable. His flagship took a direct hit that knocked out half the shield generators. Kresh's ship pressed the advantage, moving closer to deliver killing blows. The older Sith Lord was visible on the bridge of his command vessel, personally directing the attack. He wanted to be the one who ended this, to look Sado in the eye as his rival's ambitions finally died. Sado watched his fleet disintegrating around him. Ship after ship went dark, their reactor signatures fading as they were destroyed or abandoned. His remaining forces were fighting bravely, but bravery wasn't enough. In perhaps 10 minutes, maybe 15, his fleet would be completely annihilated. Every ship destroyed, every crew killed, and him along with them. Unless he did something unthinkable. One of his vessels, a heavy cruiser that had taken catastrophic damage in the Republic campaign, was barely holding together. Its hull was breached in multiple places. Life support was failing. The captain had already reported that the ship was lost and was preparing to evacuate the surviving crew. It was going to die anyway, its reactor destabilizing, the whole structure minutes from breaking apart. Sado opened a direct channel to that ship's bridge. He overrode the captain's command codes, taking personal control of the vessel's helm. The captain tried to protest, tried to understand what was happening, but Sado cut him off. There were still 300 Sith aboard that cruiser, 300 lives about to be sacrificed. He aimed the dying ship directly at Kressh's flagship. Then he locked the helm and severed his connection, leaving the crew no way to alter course. The cruiser began accelerating, its damaged engines burning at maximum thrust, driving it straight toward Kressh's position. On Kressh's bridge, warning alarms started screaming. Tactical officers shouted reports about the incoming vessel. They tried evasive maneuvers, but capital ships don't turn quickly. The cruiser was already too close, moving too fast. Impact was inevitable. Kressh understood what was happening in those final seconds. He saw Sadow's face on his view screen, saw the cold calculation there. His rival was willing to murder his own people, 300 loyal Sith, just to achieve victory. It was monstrous. It was unthinkable. It was perfectly in character. The cruiser slammed into Kressh's flagship like a meteor strike. The explosion was visible from the surface of Korriban, a brief new star burning in orbit, bright enough to cast shadows across the Valley of the Dark Lords. The two ships, locked together by the impact, disintegrated in a cascading series of reactor detonations. Metal vaporized. Plasma expanded in a sphere of destruction that caught two nearby vessels and crippled them instantly. Ludo Kressh died in that explosion. After a lifetime of service to the Empire, after decades on the Council, after surviving political intrigues and assassination attempts, he died because his rival was willing to do something he'd never have considered. The traditionalist, the defender of Sith values, killed by someone who valued nothing except his own ambition. The wreckage tumbled through space, glowing fragments that would eventually fall into Korriban's atmosphere and burn up. Somewhere in that debris field was what remained of Ludo Kressh, though no individual pieces could be identified anymore. Everything had been reduced to atoms. The surviving ships in Kressh's fleet ceased firing, their crews stunned by what they'd witnessed. They'd just watched their leader murdered along with 300 other Sith. The moral weight of that, the sheer callousness of using your own people as a weapon, paralyzed them. Some ships began withdrawing. Others simply held position, waiting for orders that would never come. Sadow should have felt triumphant. He'd won. His greatest rival was dead, eliminated in a single brilliant stroke. But as he looked at what remained of his own fleet, at the handful of ships still operational, he felt only exhaustion. Too many disasters, too many losses, too much destruction. This wasn't victory. It was mutual annihilation that he'd happened to survive. He barely had time to process that thought before new signatures appeared on sensors. Ships dropping out of hyperspace right on top of the battle. Dozens of them. Their reactor signatures, identifying them as Republic vessels. Empress Teta's fleet had followed him all the way to Korriban. The war wasn't over. It had just entered its final desperate phase, and Naga Sadow, Dark Lord of the Sith, had run out of clever tricks to save him. The Second Battle of Korriban lasted less than an hour, but it ended the Sith Empire. Empress Teta's fleet arrived fresh and at full strength. They'd been pursuing Sadow for weeks, following the trail of his retreat across hyperspace routes, determined to finish what he'd started. When they dropped into real space above Korriban and saw two Sith fleets already engaged in what appeared to be a civil war, they didn't hesitate. They attacked immediately. Sadow's remaining ships were in no condition to fight. Most had expended their weapons, their shields were down, and their crews were at the breaking point. The vessels that had been part of Kressh's fleet were leaderless and confused. Neither group mounted an effective defense against the Republic assault. The battle, if it could even be called that, was more like an execution. Republic cruisers moved through the scattered Sith forces methodically, destroying ship after ship. Some Sith captains tried to surrender. The Republic, motivated by months of Sadow's attacks on their worlds, wasn't accepting surrenders today. They'd come to eliminate a threat, and they were thorough about it. Sadow managed to escape, barely. Using Sith sorcery and the last reserves of his flagship's power, he created enough confusion to break away from the engagement. He fled deeper into Sith space, eventually finding his way to Yavin 4, a remote moon where he would spend his remaining years in exile. But that's a different story. What matters is that he left behind the ruins of everything he'd tried to build. The Republic forces, having dealt with the immediate Sith presence above Korriban, turned their attention to the planet itself. Landing parties deployed to the surface, Jedi Knights leading Republic soldiers through the Valley of the Dark Lords. Their mission was to catalog and destroy Sith artifacts, to eliminate any potential threat before it could resurface. They found tombs beyond counting, chambers filled with Sith holocrons, ancient weapons, scrolls of dark side knowledge accumulated over millennia. Some of it they destroyed on sight. Other pieces, deemed too dangerous to demolish but too valuable to leave, were taken back to Republic space for study. The Jedi Council would lock these artifacts in their deepest vaults, hoping to keep Sith knowledge contained. But they couldn't destroy everything. The Valley of the Dark Lords was simply too vast, the tombs too numerous. After weeks of searching, the Republic forces withdrew, satisfied they'd eliminated the major threats. Behind them, Korriban returned to silence. The dead Sith Lords remained in their tombs, their secrets buried but not gone. Supreme Chancellor Pultimo wasn't satisfied with just Korriban. He ordered a full-scale invasion of the entire Stygian caldera. Republic fleets jumped from system to system, targeting every world they could identify as part of the former Sith Empire. Zeost, the administrative capital, was occupied and its government structures dismantled. Relg, Kressh's homeworld, was bombarded from orbit until its fortresses were rubble. The surviving Sith scattered. Some fled into the unknown regions, disappearing into uncharted space where the Republic couldn't follow. Others went into deep hiding, assuming false identities and trying to blend into the wider galaxy. A few even surrendered to the Jedi, renouncing the dark side in exchange for their lives. Whether those conversions were genuine or tactical, no one could say. The empire that Marka Ragnos had built, over 120 years of careful rule, was gone in less than 12 months. Everything Ludo Kressh had fought to preserve was ashes and memories. The Golden Age had ended not gradually, but catastrophically, torn apart by internal conflict and external invasion. The irony would have destroyed Kressh if he'd lived to see it. His entire philosophy had been about preservation, about protecting what they had rather than risking it on expansion. He'd opposed Sado specifically because he'd seen this outcome. The invasion would fail, the Republic would discover them. The Empire would fall. He'd been right about everything. And yet, his opposition had contributed to the very destruction he'd feared. The civil war between his faction and Sado's had weakened the Empire at the critical moment. His attack on Car Delba had cost resources and lives that might have made a difference in the war with the Republic. His final confrontation with Sado above Korriban had left both fleets vulnerable when the Republic arrived. Perhaps if Kressh had found a way to work with Sado, to channel his rival's ambition rather than opposing it absolutely, things might have ended differently. Perhaps if he'd been willing to compromise, to accept that some change was necessary, the Empire could have adapted and survived. Or perhaps the conflict was inevitable, written into the very nature of the Sith philosophy that celebrated strength and punished weakness. There's no way to know. History doesn't offer do-overs or alternate timelines. There's only what happened, and what happened was extinction. Ludo Kressh's body, what little remained of it after the explosion, eventually fell from orbit. The debris from his flagship burned up in Korriban's atmosphere, scattering across the desert in a rain of metal and ash. But the Sith have ways of honoring their dead that don't require intact remains. In the years following the war, surviving Sith who returned to Korriban in secret constructed a tomb for him in the Valley of the Dark Lords. It wasn't as grand as Marka Ragnos's tomb, or as elaborate as some of the ancient monuments, but it was proper, built according to tradition, placed among the other Dark Lords who'd shaped Sith history. The entrance was carved into a cliff face above a cave system inhabited by Shiraks, leathery flying creatures that nested in Korriban's darkness. Inside, the tomb contained what artifacts of Kressh's life could be recovered: his writings, his holocrons, physical objects imbued with his Force presence. The tomb also contained something else: traps. Yes, as was traditional for any Sith burial, but also something more insidious: Kressh's residual Force presence. His accumulated dark side energy had soaked into the very stone of the chamber. Anyone who entered would be subjected to visions, powerful hallucinations drawn from their own minds but twisted by Kressh's lingering essence. These visions had a purpose. They showed visitors the consequences of ambition unchecked, of innovation without wisdom, of breaking from tradition without understanding why those traditions existed. In death, Kressh continued to teach the lessons he'd tried to convey in life. Whether anyone learned from those lessons was another question. His family line survived the Empire's fall. The Kressh bloodline continued, scattered across the galaxy, but maintaining their identity. Millennia later, when a new Sith Empire rose in the unknown regions, descendants of Ludo Kressh were there. Vodal Kressh, a powerful alchemist who would eventually rebel against the Sith Emperor. Exile Kressh, who served as the Emperor's apprentice before her own betrayal. The family name carried weight in Sith circles, associated with both loyalty and rebellion, tradition and resistance. But all of that was far in the future. In the immediate aftermath of the Great Hyperspace War, there was only destruction. The Republic had won a complete victory, eliminating what they saw as a dark side threat before it could fully mature. The Sith, or what remained of them, had learned a terrible lesson about the cost of ambition and division. And on Korriban, in a tomb carved into ancient stone, Ludo Kressh lay in darkness. The guardian of tradition, the voice of caution, the Sith Lord who'd been right too late. His warnings had gone unheeded. His wisdom had been rejected. And the Empire he'd served his entire life had paid the ultimate price for ignoring him. The desert winds blew over his tomb, carrying red sand that slowly covered the entrance. In time, the exact location would be forgotten by all but a few. Korriban returned to its ancient silence, a graveyard world keeping its secrets, while the galaxy moved on without the Sith. Or so everyone believed. But the dark side of the Force doesn't disappear just because its practitioners are defeated. It waits, it endures, and eventually, inevitably, it returns. There's a philosophical puzzle at the heart of Ludo Kressh's story, and it's one that defined the Sith long before his time and would continue to define them long after. The Sith Code, which every acolyte learns from their first days of training, celebrates passion and strength. It teaches that peace is a lie, that there is only passion. Through passion, one gains strength. Through strength, power. Through power, victory. Through victory, one's chains are broken. It's a philosophy that fundamentally rejects stagnation, that demands constant striving, constant evolution, constant struggle. And yet, Ludo Kressh dedicated his life to preservation, to maintaining what existed rather than constantly tearing it down to build something new, to tradition and orthodoxy rather than innovation and change. How do you reconcile that with Sith philosophy? The answer is that you can't, not really. And that internal contradiction is what makes his story so tragic. Kressh believed in the Sith. He believed in their superiority, their right to power, the validity of the dark side philosophy. But he also recognized something that many Sith refuse to acknowledge, that constant internal struggle, while it might strengthen individuals, could weaken the collective, that breaking your chains was meaningless, if doing so brought the entire structure crashing down on everyone. Marka Ragnosi's reign proved that stability could work for the Sith. Over a century of prosperity, of growth, of genuine achievement, The Empire flourished precisely because it wasn't constantly tearing itself apart, because Ragnos was powerful enough to prevent others from challenging him successfully, because the period of internal peace allowed them to build rather than just destroy. Kressh saw that and thought it should be the model going forward. Find a stable configuration and maintain it. Don't fix what isn't broken. The Empire worked, so preserve it. It was logical, it was rational, and it was completely antithetical to what the Sith actually believed at their core. Naga Sadow represented the other extreme. Pure ambition without caution. The Sith philosophy taken to its logical conclusion, where every limitation must be challenged, every boundary pushed, every risk taken in pursuit of greater power. Sadow looked at a successful empire and saw stagnation. He looked at prosperity and saw complacency. He couldn't conceive of a universe where the Sith weren't actively conquering, weren't expanding, weren't fighting. Both positions had merit. Both were flawed, and because neither lord could find middle ground, because compromise felt like weakness to both of them, the Empire was torn apart. Think about how different things might have been if they'd found a way to work together. Thifresi's caution could have tempered Sadow's ambition. Sadow's vision could have pushed Kressh beyond simple preservation. Together, they might have crafted a strategy that was both bold and sustainable. A gradual expansion that didn't expose the Empire to retaliation it couldn't handle. Careful preparation for the eventual conflict with the Republic rather than rushing into war unprepared. But that would have required both of them to admit they didn't have all the answers. It would have required Kressh to accept that some change was necessary. It would have required Sadow to acknowledge that caution wasn't the same as cowardice, and neither of them could bend without feeling like they were breaking. There's a deeper truth buried in this failure. The Sith philosophy makes true cooperation almost impossible. When your entire worldview is built on the idea that conflict strengthens you, that the strong should dominate the weak, that power is the only thing that matters, you create a culture that inevitably destroys itself. Every generation of Sith has to learn this lesson again. Master and apprentice, rival lords, competing factions. The cycle repeats endlessly because it's built into the foundation. The dark side, for all its power, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. Kressh understood this intellectually, but he couldn't escape it personally. He tried to break the cycle by defending tradition, but in doing so, he just created a different kind of conflict. His resistance to Sadow was as much a product of Sith nature as Sadow's ambition was. Neither of them could step outside the pattern they'd been raised in. The real question his story poses isn't whether he was right or wrong about invading the Republic. He was obviously correct that the invasion would fail and the consequences would be catastrophic. That's not even debatable. The question is whether being right mattered when his method of opposing Sadow contributed so much to the disaster. Was he defending the Empire, or was he just fighting for dominance against a rival? Did he genuinely believe in his conservative philosophy, or was he rationalizing his own hunger for power with prettier words than Sadow used? These aren't easy questions, and the honest answer is probably that both were true simultaneously. Kressh was a true believer in traditional Sith values. He genuinely wanted to protect the Empire and its people. His warnings about the Republic were sincere, his fears well-founded. But he was also ambitious. He wanted to be Dark Lord. He wanted his vision to triumph over Sadow's, not just because he thought it was better for the Empire, but because he wanted to win. That duality makes him more interesting than a simple cautionary tale. He's not just the conservative who was right, but ignored. He's a complex figure whose good intentions were inseparable from his personal ambitions, whose wisdom was compromised by his ego, whose ultimate failure was both tragic and inevitable. Later generations of Sith studied his story, and drew different conclusions based on their own philosophies. Some saw him as a martyr for proper Sith conduct, a lord who understood that power meant nothing if you didn't have anything left to rule. Others saw him as a failure, someone so caught up in the past that he couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. A few recognized him as a victim of the fundamental Sith contradiction, trying to serve a philosophy that made the very things he fought for impossible to achieve. All of these interpretations have validity. The story is complex enough to support multiple readings. What's undeniable is that Ludo Kressh's life and death represented something significant in Sith history. The end of an era, certainly, but also a question that would plague the Sith for millennia afterward. Can an order built on conflict and ambition ever create something lasting? Can tradition and innovation coexist in a philosophy that celebrates destroying the old to make way for the new? Can the Sith ever truly unite, or are they doomed to forever tear themselves apart from within? Kressh never found the answers. Maybe there aren't any. Maybe the questions themselves are the point, the struggle that defines what it means to wield the dark side. Or maybe he was just a Sith Lord who fought for what he believed in and lost. Sometimes, the simplest explanation is the right one. On Korriban, the winds never truly stop blowing. They sweep across the Valley of the Dark Lords in patterns that seem almost deliberate, as if guided by invisible hands. Red sand rises in veils, obscuring the ancient tombs for moments before settling again. The particles catch the light of the twin suns, creating hazes of amber and rust that soften the harsh edges of the monuments. In the early morning, when the temperature drops and the air grows still, you can almost hear whispers carried on those winds, names of the dead, fragments of forgotten oaths, echoes of ambitions that once burned bright enough to reshape the galaxy. Ludo Kressh's tomb stands among those monuments, weathered now by millennia but still recognizable. The entrance carved into the cliff face depicts traditional Sith iconography, symbols of power and dominion, rendered in stone that has slowly darkened with age. Shiraks nest in the caves below, their leathery wings rustling in the darkness. Occasionally one will emerge into the dim light, circle the tomb entrance, and disappear back into the depths, as if keeping watch, as if remembering. Inside the tomb, the air feels heavier somehow, thicker. The dark side presence is still there, accumulated over centuries, preserved by the very nature of the place. Visitors who enter, and there have been precious few over the millennia, report visions. Hallucinations that feel more real than memory. They see Kressh arguing before the Sith Council, his voice steady as he warns of dangers his colleagues refuse to acknowledge. They see him leading Ragnos's funeral procession, carrying the weight of tradition on his shoulders. They see the moment his flagship exploded, the instant when certainty gave way to surprise, and then to nothing. These aren't just recordings somehow imprinted on the stone. They're lessons, crafted deliberately by whoever constructed this tomb, perhaps by Kressh himself, in the days before his death, when he knew confrontation was coming and wanted to leave something behind. A warning for future Sith who might find themselves facing similar choices, a reminder that being right means nothing if you can't convince others to listen. But tombs on Korriban are meant to be forgotten. That's their purpose. In a way, they preserve the dead so that the living can move on. The galaxy doesn't pause for anyone, not even Dark Lords who shaped the course of history. Life continues, empires rise and fall, and eventually even the most significant events fade into the background noise of time. 3,000 years after Kressh's death, a Jedi Knight named Mitra Surik visited his tomb. She was following her own path, seeking understanding of the Force in its totality, light and dark. The visions she experienced in that ancient chamber showed her things about her own past, her own choices, The tomb used her memories as raw material, twisting them into lessons about the cost of certainty, the danger of inflexibility, the tragedy of being unable to compromise. She left the tomb shaken but enlightened. Kressh's legacy, preserved in stone and force energy, had touched another life across an impossible span of time. His warning had found one more student, even if that student walked a path completely opposite to his own. But most who visit Korriban never enter the smaller tombs. They're drawn to the grand monuments, the famous Dark Lords whose names still carry weight. Marka Ragnos, Ajunta Pal, Tulak Horde. Ludo Kressh is a footnote in most histories, his story compressed to a paragraph about Naga Sado's rise to power. The conservative who opposed progress, the cautious lord who was right but still lost, a minor character in someone else's epic. Perhaps that's appropriate. Kressh himself would have valued being forgotten if it meant the empire survived. He didn't fight for personal glory. He fought to preserve something he believed was worth protecting. That it failed, that his efforts came to nothing, doesn't diminish the sincerity of his convictions. It just makes them tragic. The desert surrounding his tomb stretches for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Dunes rise and fall like frozen waves, their shapes constantly changing as the wind redistributes the sand. Here and there the ruins of other structures emerge from the ground, academies where young Sith once trained, temples where dark side rituals were performed, statues of forgotten lords whose names have been scoured away by centuries of sandblasting wind. All of it empty now, all of it silent. Korriban's twin suns move across the sky in their eternal dance, rising and setting, marking days that no one counts anymore. The planet has seen empires rise and fall, has witnessed the Sith at their greatest heights and their lowest defeats. It remembers everything and nothing, a vast repository of history that no longer matters to anyone except scholars and archaeologists. At night, when both suns have set and the temperature plummets, the stars emerge. Thousands of them, perhaps millions, scattered across the darkness like grains of that same red sand blown into the void. Each one a sun like Korriban's, many of them hosting worlds where beings live and die, dream and struggle, build and destroy. From that perspective, the conflicts that consumed Ludo Kressh seem impossibly small. Two Sith Lords arguing over the direction of one empire in one corner of one galaxy. Their war affected billions, yes, but the universe contains trillions upon trillions of beings. Most of them never knew the Sith existed. Most lived their entire lives without ever hearing the names Kressh or Sado or even Marka Ragnos. Does that make their stories less important, or does it provide a kind of comfort? The weight of their struggles, which must have seemed unbearable at the time, was actually quite finite. Measured against the scope of the cosmos, even the greatest catastrophe is just a ripple that eventually fades. Ludo Kressh spent his life trying to hold back change. He fought to preserve an empire he believed was perfect as it was. He saw threats everywhere, dangers that would destroy everything if they weren't prevented. And he was right about so many of those threats. But he lost anyway, because the universe tends toward change regardless of what anyone wants. Stasis is temporary, transformation is constant. His tomb remains, though, solid stone carved with purpose, built to last. Inside, in the deepest chamber, there's a sarcophagus that may or may not contain his actual remains. It doesn't really matter. What matters is the space itself, the intention behind its creation. Someone thought Ludo Kressh deserved to be remembered. Someone believed his story had value worth preserving. And so it endures, not as a grand monument that draws pilgrims from across the galaxy, not as a famous landmark that everyone recognizes, just as one more tomb in a valley full of them, one more story among thousands, one more voice in the chorus of the dead. speaking to whoever still has ears to hear. The winds continue their endless circulation. Sand drifts against stone, slowly eroding details that took months to carve. Shiraks wheel through the darkness, hunting insects that emerge only at night. The planet turns, the suns rise, and another day begins on Korriban. Far above, beyond the atmosphere, space holds the debris of ancient battles, fragments of the fleets that destroyed each other in Kressh's final confrontation with Sado. Most of it has decayed or been pulled down by gravity over the millennia. But some pieces remain in stable orbits, silent witnesses to conflicts they helped create. And further still, beyond Korriban's system, beyond the Stygian caldera, the galaxy continues its grand rotation. Stars are born in nebula, others collapse into black holes. Civilizations rise, flourish for their brief moment, and fall into ruin. The Force flows through all of it, light and dark in constant motion, neither ever truly winning, neither ever truly losing. Ludo Kressh believed he was fighting for the survival of the Sith. In the end, the Sith did survive, though not in the form he would have wanted. They evolved, adapted, changed. The rule of two that would later define them was as far from his vision of a vast empire as anything could be. But it worked, after a fashion, keeping the Sith alive through centuries when the Jedi thought them extinct. Would he have approved? Probably not. It violated too many of his principles about tradition and the proper structure of Sith society. But then again, his principles led to the Empire's destruction, so perhaps his approval isn't the metric by which survival should be measured. These are questions without answers, philosophical puzzles that you can turn over in your mind as sleep approaches, not to solve them, because they can't be solved, but simply to contemplate them, to consider the vast sweep of history, the tiny role each individual plays in it, and the strange ways that even failures can become meaningful with enough time and distance. The desert is patient, the tombs are silent, the stars wheel overhead in patterns too vast to comprehend, and somewhere in all of that, the story of Ludo Kressh rests, neither forgotten nor remembered, existing in that strange space where history becomes legend, becomes myth. Let that image carry you now. The red sands of Korriban shifting in the wind, the ancient tombs keeping their vigils, the endless sky above, dark and full of stars. Let the weight of millennia settle over you like a blanket. Let the distance of 5,000 years soften the edges of ambition and conflict and loss. There's peace in antiquity, in knowing that even the most terrible struggles eventually fade into the background, that the galaxy moves on, that the Force, in its infinite complexity, balances everything eventually. Rest now, as Ludo Kressh rests in his tomb, as all the ancient Sith rest in theirs, as empires rest beneath the sand, and conflicts rest in the silence of history. The story is complete. The lessons have been taught, whether anyone learns from them or not. And the desert wind continues to blow, carrying red sand across monuments to forgotten power, patient and eternal, and entirely at peace.